Fellow travelers through time, a single breath of the city, oily, acrid, impossibly near, pulls you fully awake. You smell it before you see it, a metallic tang, then a deeper perfume of burning pitch and resin. It moves downhill through the alleys like a thinking thing, slipping under shutters, clinging to damp wool, finding warm places behind stacked amphorae. For a few heartbeats, you are only the nose of Rome itself, cataloging, naming, refusing to be surprised. On the night of July 18th, AD 64, according to the historian Tacitus, that first smell became a question that would not be answered by morning. From the quarter near the Circus Maximus, a dense knot of shops, wooden houses, and stalls, a light took hold and then a will. It fed, it climbed, it paid no heed to ownership or rank. At first the city moves in small human rhythms. A baker wakes to his own cough of flour and embers. He clamps a clay lamp and curses the wind. A boatman returning from the Tiber checks his cloak's hem. A matron pulls a blanket tight and thinks of the loaf rising while her husband counts the coins that will or will not change their lives. You are walking those streets now, or imagine you are. The second person lets you feel the city's skin. The flames do not begin with spectacle. They begin as a heat, a popping, a guttering. A window explodes inward, lamps tip. That initial smell becomes a chorus, acrid pitch, sweet rot of thatch, the sharp metallic of heated bronze. Remember this, Rome for ordinary people was often timber and tinder. Many insulae, apartment blocks, leaned toward the street with overhanging balconies and wooden beams. Warehouses held oil, wine, and spices. A summer breeze could carry a spark from a brazier to a store of pitch. Add the press of narrow lanes and the shoving of carts, and a small error becomes a city's undoing. In the first hours, there is confusion more than spectacle. Neighbors throw mattresses and chests into carts. Someone drags the household lar, the little shrine, as though superstition might anchor fate. Smoke blinds. Breathing becomes a calculation. Men and women shout the names of family, of slaves, of customers. Ladders are pulled, not always by those who can afford them. Where ladders fail, hands make do and take terrible risks. Official response is a patchwork. Rome has no municipal fire brigade in the modern sense. There are slave brigades controlled by wealthy patrons, watchmen, and improvised crews. Bells ring, for warning, for priests to hurry, for citizens to pour into the streets. The Tiber, which by day moves sluggish and reflective, is thronged at night, with boats ferried to carry goods, to ferry people, to become floating points of frantic light. Close to the Palatine, Borsto, where imperial houses cluster, the heat becomes personal. Nero, the emperor, will later be bound in rumor and accusation, portrayed by some later authors as a man singing while his city burned. That image is slippery. Contemporary sources are partisan and fragmentary. We must hold rumor and record at arm's length. Still, the palace's proximity means that the fire's path will inevitably touch the narratives of power. Amid the chaos are ordinary acts that matter most. A young man hands his mother the last spoon. A priest wraps a child's head in a tunic to ease smoke. An old woman chooses, with a quiet and terrible clarity, which coins to keep and which to leave. These small, private calculations are the human ledger of catastrophe. The night stretches. Fires flare in separate quarters, as if the city were a string of torches. From the Forum to the riverbank, the smell becomes the story everybody shares, in whispers, in curses, in the furious scratch of packing. People on the Coelian Hill see the Palatine rooflines glow and cannot decide whether the morning will bring salvage or ruin. Tacitus writes that the flames burned for 6 days before rekindling. Later authors vary in their reports. Some blame accident, some charge arson, some seek scapegoats in the Christian minority who are later accused. Modern historians debate motives and probabilities. For now, the city is simply burning, and the questions of blame are not yet urgent to a mother carrying a child. Outside the immediate fire's ring, a different kind of sorrow gathers, the knowledge that whole trades may be erased. The tannery, the coffered wine stores, the small workshops that gave neighborhood its tone, all can become ash. In the morning, the city will reckon not only with dead and saved, but with livelihood erased, memory charred. A man coughs on the Coelian slope and looks down. Orange tongues reach higher than a home should allow. He thinks, for a sliver of a moment, of the stone monuments that seem to promise permanence. Then a beam collapses, flinging embers like a scatter of coins, and permanence feels, suddenly, like a lie. Night deepens. The bells toll. The smoke has taught people a new intimacy with one another. Hands meet where they would not have before. Strangers are given place in a cart. Still, an uneasy question hangs in the black between rhythms of hasty rescue. How much of Rome will remain when the sun rises? The city wakes into ruin as if from a fever dream. Where the night had been a living black, dawn reveals a different palette. Ashen grays dusting every surface. A dull red still pooled in the hollows of roof timbers. Sunlight turned thin by the long breath of smoke. The alley gutters are full of broken pottery and char. Pigeons pick through the detritus with the same small, indifferent hunger as they ever had. The smell has changed but not gone. The sharpness of fresh burning has mellowed into a bitter, toothache perfume of char and sour oil. It clings to the breath like a memory. Rome's body counts losses quietly at first. An old man pries at a collapsed lintel until his hands numb. A child is found asleep beneath a half-burnt blanket and wakes to a city they do not recognize. In many neighborhoods, the first daylight reveals an absence more than a presence. Doorways that have no doors because the wood is gone. Staircases that lead to nothing. The crusted black where a roof once smiled over a family's meals. Officials arrive. Where the smoke is thickest, magistrates and aides move like men practicing unfamiliar gestures, ordering, measuring, taking note. Tacitus records that the emperor took steps, opening the gardens and public buildings to the homeless, arranging for food to be distributed, but he also notes how quickly rumor tangled the facts. People always want a cause and a culprit. They also want someone who will fix what is broken. In the hours after the flames, both impulses run through every crowd. On the Campus Martius, under the wide, familiar sky, refugees form lines for grain. Men who had been accountants or artisans the day before stand mute with their jars and bowls. Women with ash-smudged faces trade stories and whispers. Which neighbor got out? Which shop vanished? Who lifted a chest to the street and walked away without the coins inside? The wealthy set guards around salvaged statues and vases. Slaves run in and out of half-intact shops with faces as hard as stone. Theft, opportunistic, panicked, sometimes organized, follows where law frays. So does generosity. Where one man thrusts a bundle into a stranger's hands, another shoves a spear into a door jamb to claim the house as a prize. Social bonds stretch, tear, and knit anew in minutes. Beneath the official gestures of relief, there grows a quieter seam of decisions. Landlords assess whether to rebuild. Shopkeepers estimate the stock lost to flame and water. Craftsmen taste ash and decide whether their tools can be saved. These are small acts of arithmetic and hope, and they shape whether the city will return to its old lines or take a different shape entirely. Across the Tiber, on streets that escaped the biggest blazes, the air is lived in but different. There is a nervous energy that vibrates in market calls and the clang of hurried repairs. In houses near the river, men unload sacks of grain that had come to market that very morning. Tenants barter for a corner of a room. In a bakery that has escaped damage, the baker, a broad-shouldered man with ash streaking the hollows of his cheeks, kneads and distributes bread without counting who will pay. The calculus of survival rewrites customary economy. Rumor collects like cinder. Some say the fire started by accident in a shop of kerosene and lamp oil. Others whisper it was set deliberately, that hands moved with intention among the streets. A more damaging rumor fastens itself like a burr. Some accuse the emperor, claiming the blaze made empty land where he had wanted to build. Ancient writers record these whispers. Tacitus, Suetonius, Cassius Dio, but they are careful, each with their own slant. Modern readers must be careful too. The line between fact and accusation is often the line between power and the powerless. By midday, the city's institutions show strain. Grain distributions are uneven. Emergency shelters are crowded. Corpses are carried, and where there is a sudden stack of the dead, the responsible officers, the vigiles, the watchmen who had attempted to fight the blaze, arrange hurried burials or piles of temporary markers. The sight of bodies stacked or shrouded is indiscriminately shocking. For those who survive, such images will lurk for years. Into this climate of physical and moral disarray comes a politicized answer: scapegoats. Tacitus tells us that Nero blamed a small, despised group, Christians, and subjected them to brutal punishments to divert attention from charges that he had been indifferent or culpable. History records these prosecutions, and later authors amplify them into a story of theatrical cruelty. It is true that people needed reasons. It is also true that vulnerable minorities often supply them. For the moment, the accusation functions as a dangerous kind of balm, a story that offers an enemy to hate, and a narrative that seems to make sense of senseless loss. Meanwhile, decisions about the city's shape take root among the powerful. Proposals circulate to widen streets, to create open spaces that will halt future conflagrations, to require new building rules. These plans may be born of practicality or ambition, sometimes both. Nero's later building projects, including a vast new palace complex, the Domus Aurea, will be read by many as the fruit of this catastrophe. Where something had burned, something imperial will grow. Historians debate motive and timing. Rumor will always take pleasure in tying design to desire, collapse to conquest. But the ash is not yet cool enough to be read cleanly as the skeleton of a plan. For ordinary Romans, the present is a more immediate arithmetic. Where to sleep tonight, how to recover possessions, how to bury a neighbor. The city's life presses on in small routines made urgent. A mother sweeps the soot from a corner like a benediction. A child arranges salvaged bits of glass as if arranging a shrine. A carpenter counts the straight timbers left unburnt and considers offers. As day moves toward the exhausted gold of evening, the city feels like a creature with a new scar. People talk of the night the fire, and the name will hold weight for years. Some measure loss in coin, some in memories. Artifacts pulled from ash, a ring, a scratched stylus, a half-burned scroll, carry a tiny private grief that official accounts cannot capture. And yet, even amid the ruin, planning begins for a city to be remade. Men with measuring rods pace the edges of raised blocks. They talk in the clean language of dimensions and lines, but the talk always slips into doubt, into debate about who will profit from new streets and new lots. Already, ownership is a battlefield. Then a new whisper reaches the crowds, not of blame this time, but of movement. Imperial freedmen and architects have been seen consulting near the Palatine. Where they go, decisions follow. For many of those who have nothing left, such counsels offer little solace. For those with influence, they smell opportunity. The sun dips and the ash settles into the city's skin. Somewhere, in a courtyard washed of life and light, a charred scrap of paper clings to a collapsed beam. A ledger, perhaps, with columns of names now ghosted by soot. It hints at a future reckoning. Who will be paid? Who will be forgiven? Who will be dispossessed? The morning slides into a long, work-worn afternoon. Where the fire has passed, people move like those learning a new language. Slow gestures, repeated motions, awkward with urgency. Hands sift ash for small certainties. An amulet, a child's toy, a charred stylus, and bring them into the light as if proof that life continued here. Dust gathers in the folds of togas. Soot streaks cheeks like bruises. The city's noises have altered. Fewer carts, more voices, bargaining threaded through grief. In a ruined insula, a carpenter crouches among warped beams. He runs a fingernail along a blackened grain, listens as he taps a mortise, searching for the hollow note that promises strength. When the timber fails that test, he heaves a long breath, sets down his chisel, and covers his face with both hands. Tools are a craftsman's capital. Without them, rebuilding is impossible. He is not thinking of heroic gestures, but of work. How to square a post, where to borrow a lathe, which neighbor will trade nails for labor. Near the Tiber, some warehouses stand because their walls were stone, or their goods were light and already loaded onto barges. A wine merchant points to amphorae that have only the kiss of smoke. Men who had served tables now hustle as foremen, organizing crews to carry salvage that might pay a month's rent. The market reconfigures itself faster than magistrates can issue edicts. In the absence of immediate law, custom and muscle redraw the map of commerce. Law does arrive, in its own form. The vigilos, the city's fire watch cohorts, patrol with bodies already heavy with fatigue. They drag smoldering debris into piles for later burning, place ropes to cordon unstable houses, and shout cautions to those lifting beams without helpers. They wear their authority in practical gestures. They watch that looters do not set up shop on ruined thresholds. They identify bodies and stack them for burial. They do what institutions can do when a city has been unmade by flame. Rumor snakes through the crowds. One current asks who started the fire. Another asks who will benefit from the empty lots. Voices toss accusations in every direction. at foreigners, at greedy landlords, at the emperor who lives above the city. Ancient historians, Tacitus, Suetonius, Cassius Dio, record both action and accusation, but for Romans who have lost kin or trade, the historian's tentativeness is less pressing than the immediate ledger. Who owns that plot? Who will pay the craftsmen? Who will take on the small, ruinous business of rebuilding? On the Palatine slope, a small but decisive scene gathers. Freedmen, imperial agents who walk the shadow line between service and profit, move with measured ease, their measuring cords looped in practiced hands. An architect unrolls a parchment and draws a decisive line. A steward on behalf of a senator argues in clipped tones. The architects speak of wider streets and brick facings, of regulated heights and fire breaks. Such technical talk sounds like common sense until you notice what it obscures. Whose money will underwrite the brick? Who will be displaced by a new facade? Which neighborhoods will be deemed convenient to the palace and which will be left to smolder? This is the drama. When the city is scorched, the ground becomes both loss and possibility. Those with access to the emperor's ear or to cash can hope to buy newly emptied lots at a discount. Those without stand at the edges watching the boundaries of their lives be redrawn in charcoal. A woman in the crowd holds up a scorched wax tablet and reads a name, perhaps a husband's, perhaps a creditor's, and the syllables fall like small stones. A child slips an unbroken bead into his tunic. A slave pauses, fingers blistered, and presses a recovered cooking handle to his chest as if it were a talisman. The freedmen's smiles are thin with calculation. When they speak of regulation, they also speak of allocation. Who will build? Who will lease? Who will profit from the new streets? The architect's chalk scratches steady lines on dust. His gestures are technical, but the lines summon futures. They will mean brick and tile instead of timber for some blocks. But who pays for the brick? Who will dispossess a shopkeeper who had stood in that doorway for 30 years? Resistance gathers in quieter places. Neighbors who do not trust imperial promises gather signatures and the names of those who can attest to long leases. Craftsmen insist on rights to plots they had repaired for decades. Collegia and guilds press that communal ties count for more than a sudden decree. These are arguments that will not be settled by a single commission. They will be contested in courts, at dinner tables, in furtive exchanges in back alleys. As afternoon softens, the practical work continues. Men with measuring rods pace the skeletons of future streets, pressing their souls into the ash as if staking claim. A steward counts chalk marks and tucks a list into his sleeve. A woman clears a small hearth from a heap of ruin and finds a single ember that will brighten a meager supper. That ordinary persistence, the insistence on cooking one more meal, lighting one more lantern, keeps the city humane amid plans and plots. By dusk, the palace's slope is busy with ink-stained men carrying folded parchments into inner rooms. Lantern light picks out the white of rolled plans. Voices dip into low conspiratorial notes. From the edge of the crowd, a single name moves like a small hot coal, Domus Aurea. It is a name that will be remembered in two ways, architectural brilliance and imperial appetite. Whether it will be spoken as marvel or malediction depends on the lines men draw tonight, and on the bargains they will make tomorrow. As night collects and the last light thins into the same ash that has covered the city all day, someone laughs softly at a plan, and another man tightens his mouth. Authorization, allocation, and private negotiation travel through the same corridors. The city's new map is being sketched in charcoal and in whispers. The next day will show whether those sketches become streets for people or streets for profit. The days after the flames move in a rhythm of small mercies and sharper losses. At first light, makeshift camps bloom where courtyards once hosted looms and laughter. Blankets and thrown-down rugs become walls. Crates and crates of salvaged goods form low tables. A girl sorts a handful of blackened beads as if arranging a small history. An old baker hands out bread with a hand that trembles but insists. Public buildings, basilicas, porticos, even temples, open their colonnades to the needy. The emperor's freedmen arrange sacks of grain under archways. Magistrates attempt lists and registers, though the paper either blows away or clings stubbornly with smoke. These communal shelters hold their own fragile rules. Women fold linen into private caches and trade rumor for security. Men stand guard with poles and loud voices to discourage theft. When night comes and the air grows thick with ash again from the smoldering, there is a shared breath of vigilance. the city will not be allowed to burn twice in the same week. Yet vigilance is not enough to stop the human calculus that follows disaster. Who will buy this plot? Who will rebuild that street? Who will take on the tab of debt when a workshop's stock is gone? Nero's response arrives in two registers: public relief and architectural appetite. Sources, Tacitus gives the fullest contemporary account, record that the emperor opened the Campus Martius and the imperial gardens to shelter the displaced, and that he organized distributions of food. It is an action that reads in one sense as genuine assistance. It is also a political performance. The ruler who supplies grain is also the ruler who can imagine a new cityscape. Where one man sees charity, another sees opportunity. Both views are true enough for different streets. Against that practical backdrop, a darker, more vicious threat appears. Tacitus writes that Nero blamed and punished a class hated for their abominations, Christians, subjecting them to humiliations and executions that became a public spectacle. He describes victims sewn into animal skins and torn by beasts, others crucified, and still others burned alive to serve as nocturnal torches. These are the accounts the historian records, and they enter the Roman imagination with the terrifying clarity of courtroom testimony. Modern historians debate both the scale and the motives, whether the persecutions were a calculated political diversion, a crude attempt at scapegoating, or an escalation born of panic. What is beyond dispute is that vulnerable minorities often bear the brunt when disasters need causal narratives. A group is named, accused, and punished in ways meant to satisfy rage and fear. Imagine a court square where the condemned stand thin against the glare of public interest. For those watching, widows, artisans, freedmen, the spectacle performs a dangerous economy. It converts confusion and grief into a visible enemy. For the accused, who are by many accounts mostly ordinary urban people, merchants, craftsmen, housewives, the treatment is brutal and bewildering in its logic. They are not abstract doctrinal scapegoats, but neighbors. And that is what makes the cruelty so small and human, and therefore so readable in the mouths of historians who later write about the event. At the same time, within the inner circles of power, architects and imperial stewards begin to sketch with urgency. Proposals circulate to widen roads, to require fireproof materials like brick and stone facing, to regulate heights and to create firebreak spaces. Tacitus and later authorities mention the idea of replanning. Archaeology and later legal developments suggest Rome would not remain the same. Yet the details, exact widths, or who pays for the new brick, are practical controversies that will determine winners and losers. The phrase, rebuild for the many, can mean rebuild for the few who hold coin. And that ambiguity animates countless meetings held in private rooms where freedmen count and accountants whisper. In the workshops, artisans debate their futures in quieter, more immediate terms. A tile maker who had a modest kiln near an alley counts shards and places them into a clay cup, as if naming survivors. A slave who once ran a potter's wheel reads the shape of the broken wheelhead and knows whether he can make another. For these people, the question is never grand urban design. It is, will I be able to trade, to earn bread, to pay a debtor who knocks at the door? Their language is material, timber, lime, tile, not rhetoric. Yet their material choices will be the mortar of the new city. Not all reactions are violent or opportunistic. In the displaced camps, new forms of solidarity emerge. Collegia, associations of craftsmen and funerary groups, offer temporary shelter and coordinate burials. A guildmaster lends tools to a young man who promises to help rebuild his shop. A woman with skill in weaving teaches others to mend garments scorched at the edges. Such acts are small economies of care. They do not make headlines, but they stitch neighbors back into something like community. Rumor spreads faster than official decrees. Folk call the newly empty lots the emperor's inheritance. Others whisper that he will use the ruin to build a palace so vast it will swallow the sun. These stories take shape at taverns and in market stalls, where the smell of burnt oil still clings to the air. Suetonius and Cassius Dio later will embellish Nero's reputation with vivid, damning detail. Their moralizing frames the story for later readers. For inhabitants in the rubble, rumor is a living thing that shapes behavior. Some sell cheap to those who promise quick fiat. Others wait stubbornly to see whether the price will rise when powerful patrons move in. Buried in the ash are small evidences of life that historians and looters both prize. A wax tablet, half charred, might contain a ledger or a love note. A stylus snapped by intense heat reveals a hurried hand. These artifacts, when rescued, provide private counterpoints to the sweeping narratives produced in marble halls. They whisper of ordinary needs, rent, loans, apprenticeships, that will determine how a block is claimed and by whom. As the city slowly composes itself into a new day, a single detail moves through the crowd like a rumor with teeth. Imperial freedmen have been seen mapping plots near the Palatine, measuring with a confidence that implies plan and purpose. Those measurements, if confirmed, will translate ash into legal claims. They will also decide who gets to stay and who must walk farther to the periphery. Night falls on the scrubbed faces of the displaced, and the city holds its breath between gratitude for the grain and suspicion of the planers. A mother tucks a soot-streaked child under a blanket and hums a lullaby that once comforted her grandmother. A freedman counts coins under the lip of a bowl and cleans his fingernails with obsessive calm. Outside, in the glow of torches, men argue quietly over a line on a parchment. The city has become a place where both rumor and authority press their claim. Somewhere among the scattered ruins, a steward folds up a document and slips it into his sleeve, a small official weight that will travel on the lips of men who count houses and profit. In the morning, that document's existence will ripple outward. By midday, strangers will be bargaining on its assumption. The ash is not merely a remnant of what was lost. It is a ledger that will be read, rewritten, and contested. The city continues to be remade in the small arithmetic of survival and the large geometry of power. Morning opens on a battered skyline, where roofs once leaned together in neighborly gossip. There are now angles and gaps that look like wounds. In those wounds, people move with a fierce, almost domestic diligence. Mothers sweeping soot from a doorway, as though the action itself could stitch a life back together. Apprentices carrying what tools remain. A mason squinting at a fallen cornice and considering whether it can be reset or must be replaced. The day's work is both grief and industry. On the fringes of the burned districts, barter becomes the language of existence. Men trade tiles for labor. Women barter their linens for bread. A potter offers a month's worth of bowls in exchange for the right to reuse a kiln. The Tiber still moves, indifferent and useful. Boats become temporary warehouses. Barges shelter families. And merchants who once sold in brick-and-mortar stalls improvise market rows along the riverbank. The smell of smoke hangs like a veil, and beneath it hums a new economy that is both improvised and merciless. Amid these scenes move the agents of reconstruction, some official, some opportunistic. Architects with charcoal-stained fingers pace the edges of raised blocks, see and draw with a confident wrist. They discuss widths and facings, the practicality of brick over timber, and the need for straightened streets that might stop a spark from becoming a city. One of the most practical aims, wider lanes, sounds like civic wisdom, until you remember who benefits from straight avenues. Carts, wealthy patrons, and above all, those who can buy frontage and sell rents. In the fresh ash, regulation is not merely public safety, it is a tool. Tacitus records that measures were proposed: public land open to shelter, distributions of grain, and promises to rebuild. Modern historians read these steps and see a mixture of genuine aid and political calculation. The sources that convey these facts, Tacitus, Suetonius, Cassius Dio, are not neutral recorders. They write with agendas, and their distance from events colors what they emphasize. Still, what most contemporary accounts agree on is the strange coupling of relief and redesign. Food is given, maps are reconsidered. In the smoke-lined courtyards, ordinary people pay the immediate costs. A seamstress, her fingers stained with soot, irons a singed hem by candlelight and considers whether she can afford new linen. A boy salvages a charred wooden toy and runs it through his fingers as if consulting a future. For many, the calculus is stark. Accept a low buyout from a man with imperial connections, or risk holding out and losing everything if regulations declare a lot condemned. The legal language that determines these outcomes, leases, cadastral claims, familial deeds, can be maddeningly precise and maddeningly inaccessible to those who have lost their tablets in the flames. That is why records matter so much. Men who survive by memory become unreliable scribes. Wax tablets half-charred are treasures. A clerk who can produce an old register holds the power to keep a family in a home. In the days after the fire, one sees long lines at offices where scribes attempt to reconstruct ownership from fragments, swear affidavits, and press neighbors for testimony. The process is bureaucratic and human, legal and litigious, and it will decide countless small fates. Power moves through different hands. Imperial freedmen, those who manage the emperor's interests and sometimes his ambitions, walk the raised streets with measuring ropes like predators marking territory. Their manner is practical: measure, mark, allocate. Their presence is also political. When a freedman sketches a line and promises a contract, that sketch carries weight because it implies access. When he leaves, marketmen gossip about whose influence made the difference. Into such a vacuum step both legitimate administrators and swifter predators, men who buy deeds cheaply from desperate owners, men who promise rapid rebuilds at usurious rates, men who feed the rumor mill with tales of what the emperor will build. And here, too, the past and the future collide in the form of a palace. Talk of a vast new imperial house, Domus Aurea, gathers like smoldering tinder in taverns and porticos. The rumor is double-edged. For some, the prospect of distant imperial magnificence is a promise of work. Masons, sculptors, and tile makers may find long-term employment. For others, it is a sentence. Where the emperor's plan becomes law, neighborhood autonomy may dissolve into imperial frontage. Historians will later argue about motive, whether Nero seized the moment to realize aesthetic ambition, or whether he was merely planning what any ruler might, and the truth is complicated by the fog of partisan accounts. For those standing amid the ash, however, the rumor is not an academic question. It is a threat or an opportunity, depending on which side of a measuring rod you stand. The city's ritual life, too, bends to the new reality. Temples that have lost roofs perform altered rites beneath ad hoc shelters. Priests ply their duties in borrowed porticos. Household shrines are wrapped against dust. There is a religious choreography to disaster, public sacrifice to avert divine wrath, private vows to secure personal survival. Some believe the flames are punishment, others see them as random fate. For many, the answer lies in action rather than argument. Rebuild, pray, negotiate, keep children warm. On the intellectual margin, scribes and poets react differently. Some compose elegies for streets and for vanished statues. Others write furious lines accusing the powerful of being indifferent. Words have power in a city where memory is literal. Texts may survive where timber does not. And literature becomes another battlefield for framing blame and praise. The poetry that circulates in taverns and porticos can harden into public opinion that will outlast the smell of smoke. As rebuilding proceeds, a quieter violence takes shape, displacement cloaked as improvement. When officials estimate the cost of safer materials, brick veneers, tiled roofs, those costs are not borne equally. A senator or wealthy merchant can absorb new taxes or purchase supplies. A small craftsman cannot. Brick, for the poor, is both remedy and barrier. For the city, the net result may be fewer fires and more permanence. For individuals, it may be loss of home and trade. By evening, those who have influence have already converted measurements into proposals. A steward with a soft voice and a sharp ledger reads aloud a list of plots suggested for the palace's expansion. His listeners, some hopeful and some enraged, record the list in their minds and in ink on wax. In a corner of the forum, a woman who lost her shop whispers a vow to reclaim her place. Nearby, a freedman tucks a purse into his robe and smiles at the future. The night closes with a new and peculiar hush. The city is quieter not because the danger is gone, but because decision-making has migrated indoors. Men with parchments and architects' cords will now define lines that will be paved and sold. For those who wait in the open, families wrapped in blankets and children pressing salvaged toys into small fists, the future looks like a map being redrawn without their consent. And yet the ledger still matters. In a dim office near the Palatine, an official unfolds a sheet that bears a heavy line drawn in ink and a note in a hand known to administrators. It suggests a boundary, a seizure, and a plan. The stroke is small on the page, but its echo will be large on the ground. A messenger exits, the parchment folded in secret. Where he goes will determine whose home remains and whose life is spread thinner across the city. Dawn finds the office where decisions begin to harden. The messenger pushes open a low door and stands for a moment, breathing as if the paper itself has weight. Inside, the steward, hair streaked with ash, wrists inked with measurement marks, does not look up. He unties the folded parchment with a practiced hand. Lantern light slants across the page. The salt of smoke clings to the edges. Around him, clerks lean over disposal chests and half-broken tablets, voices low and precise. Outside, the city is an anatomy of tasks. Carts creak, hammers strike, women call the names of lost neighbors. He unfolds the sheet and reads. The lines are not long speeches. They are measurements, lot numbers, and short, decisive notes in a steady hand. The steward's finger follows a line that designates an entire swath of densely packed dwellings. He makes a small mark, and the clerks look up with the same human calculation you see in markets when a price is named. Who benefits, who pays, who loses. There is a different kind of work being done in the public squares. Magistrates attempt to inventory loss, to write the names of the dead and of the displaced on lists that are both bureaucratic and devotional, so that missing kin might be accounted for and taxed, or at least recorded. In another place, a cadet of the Vigiles argues with a bricklayer about where a cordon should be placed. Both men have soot in the scalp and sand in the hem of their garments. Their quarrel is about safety and about access. The bricklayer wants a larger area to reclaim reusable tile. The Vigile insists the area is unstable. On the Palatine, architects unroll plans and speak in the blunt, constructive language of stones and spans. They are men who translate imagination into structure, propose an axial avenue, they say, and you create movement for carts. Lay down a form of stone, and you create rooms for senators. Widen lanes, and the fire will not leap so quickly. Their words are practical. Their hands trace the lines of potential profit. Those strategies, brick facing, regulated heights, and fire breaks, will enter Roman law and crafts as new standards. But the immediate question is always payment. Who will supply the labor, and who will purchase the new tiles? Among neighborhoods, a quieter contest unfolds, the struggle to keep possessions and to keep identity. In a narrow lane, a woman, her head wrapped in a singed scarf, argues with a freedman who claims to represent a powerful patron. She shows him a wax tablet half charred and speaks with a voice that is simultaneously pleading and stubborn. That tablet, when washed and heated, might still yield the faint grooves of a lease. For the woman, the tablet is not an antique, it is her livelihood. For the freedman, it is an obstacle or an opportunity, depending on how much he offers at a bargain price. Their negotiation is a moral arithmetic played out in soot and ink. Public rituals attempt to reknit divine favor. Priests lead simple sacrifices in the shadow of columns, not the grand processions of peacetime, but smaller, quicker rites meant to calm a populace that suspects gods might be offended. People come with tokens, broken jewelry, a few coins, a vow whispered into the hollow of a temple. Faith and pragmatism intertwine. An offering can be a genuine petition, or a social gesture that broadcasts the donor's intact status. The smell of incense competes with the smell of burned oil. Smoke from altars and smoke from smoldering beams mingle until it is hard to tell what is sacred and what is ruin. Rumor, which has been a constant companion since the first flare, now sharpens into claims with names attached. Some say the fire began accidentally in shops near the Circus Maximus. Others say it was deliberate, that hands moved among the alleys with intent. A more vicious rumor, already circulating, nails blame to a minority long distrusted in certain circles, the Christians. Tacitus will later record how the emperor and his ministers turned the public anger toward this group, and the persecutions that followed will be brutal and visible. For the moment, however, the rumor functions as a kind of social field dressing. It gives a target to fury, a script that turns chaos into a story with villains and punishments. In the alleys of the Suburra, where congestion had long defined daily life, the hum of activity is both familiar and new. Merchants sweep soot from thresholds, children play among stacks of half-burned crates, and elders sit under awnings too singed to offer full shade. The Suburra has always been crowded, a tightly knit maze of shops and tenements. Its narrowness made the spread of flame tragically simple. Now, as plans for wider streets are sketched in office rooms, the Suburra becomes both symbol and bargaining chip. Widen here, says an architect, and you make the city safer. But widen for whom? The steward's pencil hovers over its name. Meanwhile, craftsmen and collegia press their claims. Guilds that once owned a corner of a trade street demand that their rights be respected when lots are reassigned. A guildmaster stands in a ruined courtyard and appeals to the crowd with a voice the city recognizes. He will argue for reparations, for access to kilns, for the right to rebuild where their workshops had stood for generations. These are not abstract pleas. They are concrete demands about who will shape the city's future hands-on. Across the forum, an artisan discovers a partial scroll curled inside a smoke-blackened box. The script is simple: an account ledger, names and sums, a casual list of debts. To a historian, such a scroll is treasure. To the artisan who recognizes his own handwriting there, it is a promise of restitution. He sits beneath a half-intact portico and slowly reads the entries, tracing with a finger the familiar marks of fellow tradespeople whose signatures might secure work or cold cash. Little by little, private documents like this will decide 100 small fates. At dusk, the steward folds the parchment and slips it into his robe. The mark he made earlier is a small circle around a name, Suburra. He does not speak aloud, but his fingers tremble just enough to reveal that the measure he has taken is weighty. Outside, the city's sounds change. Hammers slow, children are coaxed towards sleep beneath ash-dark blankets, and a slow procession of men carrying salvaged furniture makes its way toward temporary shelter. In the servants' quarter, a boy counts the coins he has kept hidden and decides to risk them on a promise. In the palatial rooms, a freedman smiles at the thought of lots soon to be assessed and sold. The city's future is being written in offices and in hearths, in the quiet arithmetic of leases and in the louder music of hammers. And yet, beneath the steward's folded parchment, beneath the inked circle that will be interpreted one way by a magistrate and another by a market man, lies a single and troubling fact. If the Suburra is redrawn for wider streets and imperial frontage, tens of thousands of lives may be forced to move. The decision is both technical and human, and it will not be decided on paper alone. Dawn opens with the small, stubborn business of making claims. The city's ruined quarters have turned into stages for practical law. People gather at offices not because law is their first love, but because paper, wax tablets, signatures, witnesses, now determines whether a family keeps a threshold or loses it to a stranger with a purse. There is a ritual to these mornings: the scraping of styluses on warmed wax, the low murmur of sworn testimony, the careful sealing of tablets with signet rings. The smoke that once choked roofs still clings to edges of clothing, but inside these public rooms, men and women speak in the measured cadence of those trying to guarantee tomorrow. At the center of this ritual stand clerks, midwives of bureaucracy, who coax facts into legal form. They set out lists, names of owners, witnesses who could swear to tenure, a note of when goods were removed. A simple tablet, an owner's lease, a record of a purchased bowl, becomes the hinge on which a life swings. Where tablets are missing, memory fills in. Neighbors swear to years of residency, and collegia leaders testify for their members. These are small human adjudications, and their fairness varies with temper and purse. Outside, in alleys still streaked with charcoal, the quarrel over materials grows louder. Brickmakers drive wagons toward the city with heavy loads of fired clay. Tile makers sell by the cartload. Men haggle in voices hoarse from shouting and smoke. A kiln's owner demands coin up front. A mason, hands raw and faces caked with ash, offers labor in exchange for future payment. Here, the city's future is negotiated in timber, tile, and the thin, bright metal of currency. The smell of wet lime mixes with the lingering scent of burned resin, an odd conflation of construction and memory. Guilds and collegia move with a corporate patience. A guildmaster convenes a meeting beneath a temporary awning: potters, carpenters, masons. They discuss claims to ovens and workshops, the sharing of kilns, and the pooling of grain to feed laborers. Such cooperation is practical, but it is also political. A guild that secures communal kilns gains leverage in the reconstruction market, a subtle power that may preserve livelihoods. The collegia, with their mutual bonds and burial funds, also play a crucial role in funerary rites. They arrange burials for those whose families cannot afford the rites and thus keep a social ledger of obligation and obligation repaid. Meanwhile, the legal and architectural debates upstairs, above the soot and barter, grow more formal. Commissions assemble: magistrates, architects, freedmen with the emperor's mandate. They consider proposals that will be turned into law: brick facing, regulated heights, straightened streets. These measures are practical attempts to mitigate future blazes. They are equally tools to restructure urban land. The language of safety, wider lanes, fire breaks, required materials, becomes the rhetoric through which property is reassessed and sometimes appropriated. In this clash of necessity and interest, testimony matters. A scribe who can read a half-charred ledger can keep a family in their home. A vocal guildmaster can persuade a magistrate to allocate a former workshop back to the community. Where testimony is lacking, influence fills the vacuum. Freedmen with soft smiles and hard lists move like tides, shifting claims toward clients who can pay or who can promise long-term service. It is not all corruption, but it is rarely pure altruism. Among the displaced, life tightens into routines that look like resistance. Mothers hang wash scraps to dry and mark them with seeds of color so they can be recognized in crowded shelters. A seamstress reworks burned hems into new tunics, threading a private defiance into every stitch. Children practice games with salvaged coins, imagining markets built from what remains. These small acts are the civic muscles of a people determined not to be reduced solely to victims. Religious life, forced to improvise, retains a certain clarity. Priests offer small rites in open basilicas. Lars and penates are wrapped in cloth and carried as if portable centers of continuity. Where a household altar survives, it is washed and anointed. A family will place a single piece of bread before the image as a signal to neighbors, we remain. For many, these gestures are as binding as any signed tablet. They mark social continuity in a way law sometimes cannot. At the same time, darker currents run through the city like hidden drains. Opportunistic buyers wander ruined blocks with quick witch hand gestures and even quicker purses. Men known for quick deals press desperate owners for sales at low prices. There are whispered auctions under the cover of night. Where official channels grind slow, private agreements move faster, and unrecorded sales will later complicate legal claims. That is, perhaps, inevitable in the wake of disaster. Speed replaces ceremony, money replaces record. Political calculation coils through every meeting. A senator's steward speaks of aesthetic lines that will glorify the Palatine. An imperial freedman talks of frontage and fees. The public good, safer streets, less combustible facings, becomes entangled with private profit. Tacitus notes such tensions. He records both the measures taken for public relief and the suspicion with which many viewed the emperor's designs. For ordinary people, the abstract tension resolves into a practical question. Will the new city make room for them, or will its grand avenues push them to the margins? In the forums where decisions will be ironed into ordinances, petitioners line up. A woman with a singed child on her hip pleads for confirmation of tenancy. A guildmaster argues for the priority of craft neighborhoods. A freedman insists on the necessity of imperial projects to restore grandeur and order. These pleas are heard by men who keep ledgers and who can seal decrees. Their pens are small instruments, but their strokes will redraw city maps. Late in the afternoon, a clerk brings a fresh tablet to the magistrate's table. It bears a list, not yet public, of lots recommended for immediate reassignment for public works. The notation is careful and clinical. Lot numbers, block lines, proposed uses. A hand has added a marginal note, hard to decipher beneath soot, but it hints at urgency. Immediate allocation for finishing of works. The magistrate doesn't speak while he studies it. His silence is not neutrality, and the hush stretches into the office like a physical thing. Outside, in the alleys and temporary shelters, the news travels like a draft under a door. Men who have been bargaining all day lower their voices. Women who had been making supper with a single recovered ember fold their hands. The communal rhythm hiccups, recalculates. A baker who had hoped to rebuild next to his old oven realizes that his block may be marked for something else. A potter who had been promised a kiln by a guildmaster suddenly worries that imperial projects will take precedence. The magistrate finally lifts his head and signs a small square by the list. His seal is a minor sound, but its echo will be significant. The clerk rolls the tablet and places it in a chest to be copied and dispatched. A courier takes the document into the light, his sandals stirring ash as he moves. In the ruined air, the courier's departure is a thin, definitive sound, law in motion, decision traveling from desk to street. Wherever he goes, someone's life will tilt. Morning after morning, the city rehearses two stubborn tasks: to remember and to forget. Memory in Rome takes many forms. It is carved in stone and inscribed on marble. It is murmured in taverns and stitched into the hems of garments. It is kept alive in ritual and also buried beneath the practical work of daily survival. In the weeks that follow the fire, both impulses run alongside each other. Men who lost their shops speak in lists: who died, who was spared, what was saved, until the lists themselves become the only reliable map of what remains. Others prefer to fold the memory tight and act, sweep the threshold, fix the hinge, barter the tile. Each strategy aims at continuity, a way to make the life before the fire press forward into the life after. The theater of public memory is also a theater of rhetoric. Poets and pamphleteers discover a new subject: the city in its ruined hymn. Some compose elegies that mourn specific streets, lines that name vendors, and describe the last morning's light on a particular potter's wheel. Others, with sharper teeth, write invective aimed at power, asking aloud whether an emperor's taste could justify a people's ash. These verses travel fast on human tongues and slow on official parchments. They live in the mouths of the market, and later on the copyist's rolls. The written word, small and smudged, may survive when timber does not. Thus, memory is an active force in the streets. But not all remembering is poetic. The city's administrators and its governors must make records that decide fate. Civic lists are compiled, property inventories, names of the dead, amounts of grain distributed, and records of relief given. Such lists are practical but also political. Who is recorded and who is omitted is not merely clerical error. It is social judgment. A slave's death may be noted on a different ledger than a free craftsman's. An entire household might be reduced to a single line on a register. The act of writing is, therefore, also an act of inclusion and exclusion. As these bureaucratic acts play out, the city's legal machinery begins to creak into action. Magistrates hear petitions, scribes copy charred tablets and recreate contracts, collegiae press claims. There are hearings where testimony matters. Neighbors swear that a family has lived on a lot for 2 generations. Guildmasters assert long-standing rights to certain workshops. Freedmen produce seals and letters that seem to make claims immediate. Law at these moments is less a neutral arbiter and more a resource to be wielded. The poor seek justice in the shadow of inked seals. The powerful use law to smooth acquisition. Within this pressure, the Christian scapegoating continues to unfold with a grim public clarity. Tacitus records that Nero singled out members of a despised sect and enacted brutal punishments that were meant to turn popular ire away from imperial doorways. Those episodes, burnings, crucifixions, mockeries, are recorded in histories and leave an indelible mark on Roman memory. The spectacle serves a purpose beyond retribution. It feeds a narrative of order restored. Yet such spectacles leave wounds that will later be read by many as a stain on the city itself. Amid the legal hearings and public spectacles, the material work continues, and the material choices bear moral weight. Brickmakers and masons become central figures in the city's fate. Where once timber framed the city's houses, now fired clay and stone are proposed as safer alternatives. The smell of lime and water becomes as common as smoke once was. Yet the cost of these materials is unevenly distributed. A senator can contract masons to build a frontage in costly stone. A potter may be asked to accept the fee of a patron to refit his kiln. Craftsmanship becomes a currency that not only rebuilds, but reallocates power. At the Palatine, the plan of an imperial compound discreetly advances. The Domus Aurea, later described by observers with a mix of awe and disdain, begins not as an edict, but as a series of practical choices. Where to buy tile, which blocks to condemn, which corridors to extend. Architects sketch in charcoal, freedmen broker deals with proprietors, laborers haul stone with hands blackened by work. The construction is, in part, an answer to urban disaster, a palace whose wide courts and formal facades will, architects claim, soothe the city's future flames by imposing order. For many on the ground, however, the Domus Aurea is a visible sign that the pattern of loss has a beneficiary. Small resistances thread through these transformations. Guilds that fear displacement mobilize petitions. Collegia that bury the dead insist on recognition. Women and neighbors collect signatures and witnesses to contest confiscations. These acts are rarely grand. They are signatures pressed into warm wax, a witness sworn by the name of an ancestor. But they are durable. Paper and testimony become a people's toolkit for insisting on presence. The cultural texture of the city shifts as well. Streets once ringed with wooden balconies are slowly replaced in some neighborhoods by brick-faced fronts. New regulations limit overhangs and require fire breaks. Market calls adapt to new topographies. Where a narrow lane once contained 5 stories of overhang, a straightened boulevard offers space for carts and parades. but it also makes rent more visible and more expensive. The aesthetic of permanence becomes the aesthetic of exclusion in the hands of private interest. Yet even as buildings rise and decrees are enforced, the human gestures endure. Families gather around a recovered hearth. A potter fires a kiln and stares at the first bowl that will be sold to a neighbor. Children invent games with charred marbles. The city is remade in both policy and habit. And then, amid the legal lists, the petitions, and the quietly rearranged markets, a rumor hardens into an order. The emperor will allocate a tract of land near the Palatine for an expansive palace complex. Men with measuring shirts or in soft purses accelerate their conversations. Magistrates place the order for special tiles. Guilds negotiate for contracts that will keep them in business for years. For those who cannot read measurement as destiny, the prospect means displacement. For others, it means steady work and profit. The question that hangs in every whispered conversation and in every clerk's ledger is simple and immutable. Who will be left standing when the new Rome is set in stone? Dawn rises like a held breath over streets that have learned to keep score. The morning begins with small, mechanical motions. A woman returning to the corner where she stacked salvaged plates the night before. A mason testing a block with the flat of his palm. A clerk arriving early to warm wax for fresh tablets. The city wakes into its new grammar: measure, prove, petition, because survival now requires both muscle and paperwork. The air is still threaded with ash. The sun is pale, as if shy about lighting so many ragged thresholds. In the calmer neighborhoods, those that escape the worst of the blaze, market life resumes with an uncanny neatness. Stall holders sweep, set out amphorae, and call across the lane. Their voices carry because the wind is functional and clear, not charged with smoke the way it was weeks before. You can hear the soft scrape of breadboards, the clink of coins, the low laugh of a man who has at least one thing to sell. That sound is a fragile currency of normalcy. But close to the raised blocks, the rhythm is different. There is a cadence of lists and a percussion of decisions. Magistrates hold court in temporary booths under colonnades. Their benches sag with tired men who have defended leases and disputed boundaries until their voices are hoarse. A woman lays a half-charred wax tablet on a clerk's desk and asks quietly for a copy to be made. The clerk warms the wax and traces an attempt to restore the inked grooves. The gesture is intimate, two people breathing the same air, rubbing soot from a name, and bureaucratic, because that name will anchor her claim. Between these acts of claim-making, the city otherwise hums with labor. Masons haul fresh bricks from distant kilns. Tile makers fire batches around the clock. Carpenters sand the edges of planks that survive the flames. The smell of wet lime, of clay warmed by sun, and of resin being mixed for waterproofing competes with the lingering tang of charcoal. A potter kneads a lump of clay and knows, by a hand's memory, whether the batch will hold a glaze or crack in the oven. For him, rebuilding is literal creation, form after form, that will, if he survives, be sold to a neighbor who needs plates. Power moves in quieter, sharper ways. The freedmen, those imperial administrators who have the ear of high places, continue to walk the ruined quarters. They do not shout, they measure. Their ropes make arcs in the ash, and the ropes make arguments. A rope stretched across a former lane becomes a line on a plan, and a line becomes a possibility, a straightened street, a frontage for the palace, a parcel for sale. The speech that accompanies each stretch of cord is pragmatic and formal, but you can hear the undertone: opportunity. In one temporary shelter, a small drama unfolds that could be any of 1,000 similar moments across the city. A baker whose oven survived argues with a magistrate's clerk because the proposed plan would remove the narrow alley that brings flour to his door. He shows receipts, corn and grain bought only last month, and the clerk takes note but also records the steward's mark on a separate parchment. That mark is the language of power. With it, decisions accelerate. The baker's voice cracks a little when he promises to hire men to rebuild if only he keeps the alley. The clerk writes the man's plea. Neither voice commands the final shape of law, yet both voices will be cited when petitions come before magistrates. Religious life continues its double work, soothing and asserting. Priests reconfigure rites for makeshift altars. Lares and domestic idols that survive the heat are cleaned and rewrapped. People come with offerings: bread, a small coin, a scrap of cloth, acts that are at once private vows and social claims. I remain, I will not be erased. Some carry these tokens toward public temples, where priests throw incense and speak phrases meant to stitch humans and gods back together. For others, the gods are only part of the story. The practical rituals, binding witnesses, swearing neighbor oaths, are the ones that keep doors in their place. Rumor, ever active, mutates into policy talk in town squares. Men argue heatedly about the Domus Aurea, its size, its meaning. Is the palace a promise of work and grandeur? Or is it an imperial appetite that will swallow neighborhoods? Those who profit say the palace will bring long contracts. Those who lose say it will make them homeless. Tacitus and later historians will record both versions. For now, people choose the narrative that helps them bargain. Words become tactics. To accuse the palace is to rally neighbors. To praise it is to seek favor. The conversation shapes the market for deeds as much as any official seal. Outside the city's formal rooms, collegia press claims with collective muscle. The Guild of Masons meets beneath an awning of patched cloth, deciding whether to lend their kilns to potters in exchange for future work. Their secretary counts signatures and promises formal testimony at the next hearing. Such mutual obligation is practical. Solidarity is also legal leverage. Where one man stands alone, a dozen voices can tip a magistrate's balance, but darker currents still run. Persecutions of marginalized groups have already been recorded in our sources. Punishments that are brutal and performative. The spectacle of punishment functions as a public reassertion of control, the state's visible action to translate private fear into public order. Those spectacles leave deep moral scars not easily described in civic plans or measured by cadastral surveys. The city's legal and physical remapping cannot erase the human cost of such acts. As the city negotiates bricks and boundaries, something small and decisive happens that will shape hearts and maps alike. A mounted courier arrives at the magistrate's office bearing a sealed dispatch. There is no shout. His arrival is simply another sound. Horse hooves on ash-dusted stones, the rattle of leather. Men stop to look because sealed dispatches mean decisions past the clerk's pen. The steward accepts the packet without ceremony, breaks the seal with a neutral mouth, and reads. His face is not cruel or kind. It is an office's face, the expression of someone who must translate ink into action. He unrolls the sheet and peers at the lists. The magistrate nearby leans closer as if to catch the words like falling coins. The document's lines are decisive. They will touch neighborhoods and livelihoods. For those in the crowd, bakers, masons, potters, mothers with soot on their cheeks, the arrival of Imperial Mark is both promise and threat. The steward folds the dispatch, nods once, and summons a clerk. Outside, the city gathers like a tide. People have learned that the smallest document can tilt a life. They look toward the magistrate's office as if toward a hearth that will either offer a roof or plunge them into deeper uncertainty. For the moment, no one speaks. The ash seems to quiet itself, listening. Tomorrow, the magistrate's clerk will speak aloud the list. Tomorrow, the lines on the parchment will be translated into posted notices nailed to door frames and shouted in squares. Tomorrow, someone's oven will be spared, and someone else's shop may be marked for seizure. And in the hush before that announcement, survivors press their faces to the day and wait. The city holds its breath as ink becomes law. Dawn breaks thin and gray. Ash hangs in the trees like slow snow. Pigeons cluster on half-intact cornices, their wings dusted with soot. In the Suburra, light falls on alleyways that smell of wet lime and smoked grain. People move with an economy of gesture now. Lift, count, bind, barter, because long decisions are made of many small ones. Amid this everyday choreography, the magistrate's clerk nails notices to boards and door frames. Black-lettered lines, terse and official, that translate the steward's sealed dispatch into public terms. The sound of the nails is ordinary and immediate. Each tap on wood is a verdict for some family. A woman looks up as the clerk hammers at her neighbor's stoop. She breathes as if to steady herself, folded shoulders set against a morning wind that smells faintly of cooking and wet plaster. The tablet on which she had recorded her lease, warm wax imprinted with a seal, sits inside her chest like a fragile thing. She watches the clerk's hand and counts heartbeats. Around her, neighbors gather in a cautious ring. Some speak in low, rehearsed legalisms. Others curse softly at luck. Children, less given to counsels of law, press close to faces they know. The posted list is methodical, block numbers, lot edges, and a few terse notations. Reserved for public works, allocated to imperial use. The clerks move like surgeons, the ink strokes are clean, merciless. When the word imperial appears against a lane that used to be a potter's row, a murmur moves through the crowd like wind through reeds. It is not yet fury. It is the slow dawning of calculation. For some, the word is promise, an opportunity to contract and work on larger projects. For many, it is bereavement. At the market, a potter named Marcellus, a common name, a recognized hand, reads the list and feels the letters as if they were blows. His kiln, once a locus of steady trade, is listed in a neat column, Lot 42, allocated. He walks to the rim of the ruined courtyard and touches the kiln's blackened lip. The clay is still warm from a firing that was interrupted by the fire. A small shard, half-baked, fits his thumb. The kiln has been his capital, his craft, the axis around which his family's life turned. Now the list gestures at its removal as if it were a neutral, administrative fact. He looks into the faces of other craftsmen, some of whom nod with tight interior anger. They speak in tradesmen's words, kiln sharing, petition writing, testimony. Their talk is not theatrical, it is pragmatic, a ledger of survival. Near the newly posted notices, a freedman who had once walked the marble halls of imperial offices stands with a measuring cord looped over his shoulder. His taste for profit is not coarse, it is steady, practiced. He watches Marcellus and the potters and thinks of contracts and tiles and profit. A clerk approaches him with a tablet, and their whispering hands fold commerce into planning. For the freedman, the imperial allocation is not merely an order, it is an opening. Rumor rushes to fill gaps that ink leaves open. At a fountain, men trade versions. Some insist the lots are needed for fire breaks and public grain stores. Others say the emperor will build a house on the cleared ground. The story grows teeth at pub counters and in shaded porticos. Suetonius and Cassius Dio, later chroniclers with sharper moral aims, will feed these rumors into the narrative of imperial appetite. For now, the people who live with soot on their hands interpret each rumor in the currency they understand. Will this let me keep my oven? Will it feed my children? In a temporary tribunal beneath a basilica's column, a guildmaster presents testimony. He lays down a half-charred wax tablet, calls witnesses, 3 men who will swear to the length of tenancy and to the guild's long-standing claim to a lane, and asks for delay. Delay is a legal tactic as old as Rome. It buys the time required to marshal witnesses, to make small coalitions of claim. The magistrate, a tired man with ash in his hair, listens and takes notes. He is attentive in a way that suggests both sympathy and the pressure of higher orders. His pen turns testimony into a record that can be appealed, challenged, or overridden. Meanwhile, the public rituals continue in a quieter register. Priests perform compact rites at shrines, and lares that survived are wrapped and placed at expedited shrines set up under public colonnades. People offer tokens, bread, a scraped silver coin, a bead, for the safety of hearth and the promise of continuity. A mother arranges a tiny ring on a lintel and crosses herself. In doing so, she performs a domestic claim that no imperial notice can immediately erase. These acts are small but stubborn. As the legal machinery grinds, acts of resistance flicker. A group of masons, organized through a collegium, stage a quiet protest. They refuse to sign over the keys to their communal kiln until a formal guarantee is written, guaranteeing work for local craftsmen. They gather signatures on a new tablet and send a runner to the magistrate's office. Such acts do not always win, sometimes they do. The power of collective testimony is one of the city's more durable protections when ink meets muscle. Anxieties sharpen into concrete conflict when the steward's list includes names of lots contiguous to the Palatine. The prospect that the emperor's projects might redraw the sacred slope of Rome provokes not only legal pleas but whispers of sacrilege. Some elders mutter that the gods will not be soothed by marble alone. Others argue that order must be bought with sacrifice. The rhetoric of safety, civic improvement, and imperial vanity blend into a difficult stew that the people taste with different palates. At mid-afternoon, word comes that a recognized official, an agent of the emperor, will be present at the forum that evening to hear petitions in person. The city responds as it always does to the presence of authority, hopeful faces, sharpened pleas, and also a small cluster of angry men who have nothing to lose. They gather in the shadow of a portico and rehearse the phrases they will use before the agent arrives. A woman, clutching a soot-streaked wax tablet, practices her appeal as if it were a prayer. She will claim a lease, she will name witnesses, she will speak of children and debts. Her voice is steady but brittle. As the city anticipates the agent's arrival, the sky darkens with a sudden summer storm, and rain begins to fall, sharp and cold, washing ash into gutters and filling the air with the keen metallic smell of wet lime and earth. For a moment, the rain seems like a benediction. It dims the dust and makes the posted letters run in places, blurring the clerk's neat ink. People press under eaves and shout as the storm lashes the market. The rain is practical. It puts out a lingering ember. It soaks the petitions. It forces bodies together in cramped cover. When the storm passes and the forum clears, lanterns are lit and the agent's chair is set beneath a portico. Men bring tablets and witnesses. Some come to plead, others to spy for a future bargain. The city holds itself taut, watching the portico's shadow as if it were the gate of fate. The agent's arrival will be a small, decisive moment, an official face to which petitions can be offered and from which immediate promises or refusals will flow. And yet before the agent appears, a courier, breathless from the rain, delivers a second sealed note to the magistrate, a postscript to the earlier dispatch. The magistrate breaks the seal in the dim light and reads. His eyes narrow. He does not speak. Instead, he folds the new paper and tucks it away, a small private movement that will not escape the notice of the clerk beside him. By dusk, the forum's shadow holds an extra tension. Whatever the magistrate now knows, whether an expansion of imperial claims, a promise of patronage, or a hardening of requisitions, will be aired soon. The crowd presses forward, and the woman with the wax tablet straightens her spine as she prepares to plead. A single question hangs in the humid evening air. Will the agent announce protections for local craftsmen, or will he confirm that imperial projects will take precedence? The portico fills as the agent takes his seat. His arrival is businesslike rather than theatrical. No trumpet, no flourish, only the leather scrape of a chair and the rustle of a cloak. Lantern light pools at his feet. The rain-slick stones throw back the crowd in glints. People press forward in pairs and small knots. Guildmasters with tablets, wives clutching soot-darkened children, freedmen with measured ropes coiled over broad shoulders. The forum smells of wet lime, of the last embers smothered, of bread being warmed in temporary ovens. It smells like a city attempting to be ordinary again. The agent's eyes travel the crowd with the economy of someone trained to read lists. He waits until the hum drops to a low expectant silence and then speaks. His voice is precise. It carries the authority of a dispatch not yet fully public. Promises of immediate relief, food distributions, temporary exemptions for small craftsmen, a commissary to allocate wood and lime, and then, in a softer register, instructions that will bite more deeply. Immediate requisition of certain lots for public works and imperial use, with a timetable for clearance. A murmur rises like a single breath exhaled across the forum. Someone near the back mutters the word imperial with the flavor of a curse. The woman clutching the half-charred tablet straightens. She rises and moves forward, small but determined. She speaks her name, the lease her father once had, the witnesses who will swear it true. Her voice is clear in the hush. The agent listens without expression. He makes one small note and says that petitions will be considered, but that the timetable for clearance is not negotiable in blocks already designated. It is an answer both balm and blade. For those whose lots are merely listed for public works, the agent's promise of temporary protections, priority to rebuild and access to communal kilns, feels like oxygen. For those whose lots are marked for imperial use, the agent's words are a sound like a gate closing. Men in the crowd look at one another, and some faces harden into the small, private fury that only hunger or property can produce. As the agent finishes, a freedman with a measuring cord steps forward on a clerk's signal and begins to pace the edge of the forum with a professional calm. He stretches the cord, measures a line, and makes a small charcoal mark on a scrap of plaster. Where his rope swings, conversations stutter. The freedman's motions convert the agent's words into something that can be touched and seen. A heated whisper runs through the crowd. They begin. Outside, men move like shadows along the newly posted lists. Clerks, freedmen, and a few soldiers whose duty is to keep order rather than to raise. Their presence is a reminder that ink gains force when backed by an arm. Where a magistrate's pen can determine the fate of a family, a soldier's quiet movement can enforce a clearance. None of this is noisy. It is a slow, procedural pressure that will, in time, empty thresholds, and change markets. In the immediate hours that follow, a fragile reprieve is granted for some. The agent authorizes temporary permits, kiln sharing agreements, exemptions from certain levies, and a promise that the grain distributions will continue. Guildmasters who had feared wholesale dispossession exhale. They begin to file appeals and compile witness lists. A mason who had stood silent all morning lets out a low laugh that is half relief and half bitterness. Marcellus the potter hears that his row is slated for reassessment. He is told to register a formal petition and to present witnesses at the hearing scheduled in 3 days. It is not victory, but it is time. Yet the private note the magistrate tucked away days before, now known, now visible in the agent's parchment, circulates among a smaller circle. It names several lots contiguous to the Palatine for immediate allocation toward an imperial complex. The clerk who whispers the detail does so with the combination of fascination and dread that gossip always bears. Some see contracts, others see eviction. The rumor grows into something more definite when, near dusk, teams begin to mark foundation lines on the ground with charcoal and rope. Men with measuring cords walk that liminal space between plan and pile. While ink and rope sort property, another darker sequence unfolds in the city's plazas. Rumors about the fire's origin have hardened into accusation. Tacitus tells us that Christians, already despised by many, were singled out and punished as a means of channeling anger away from imperial hands. In the Forum, as the agent speaks of allocations and protections, others are being led away, accused in hasty theatrical displays meant to reassure a terraced crowd. The spectacle is ugly and precise. The state converts fear into ritual punishment, offering an ersatz closure that will hollow the civic soul. In a ruined courtyard, a child finds, half buried beneath a beam, a scorched scrap of drawing, mere charcoal strokes hinting at columns in a vast enclosed space. He holds it against his chest like a talisman. To him, it is only a picture. To a passing mason, it is confirmation of a rumor. Plans larger than necessity are being sketched. The mason pockets the scrap as if to offer it to his guild. The child walks away without knowing that the sketch will travel swift and cause hard faces to gather. When night comes, the marking of the ground continues under lanterns. The freedmen's ropes stretch across the ash. Clerks copy lists. A handful of magistrates sign small seals that will be read at dawn. In alleys, women and children whisper and make final inventories, shoving what they can into sacks. In the palace district, men of influence confer late and quietly, their shadows long under the torchlight. And somewhere, under folded parchments and in the low voice of a steward who has seen much, the future takes a first technical form. Measured lots, foundation stakes, a schedule for clearing. It is a step that will turn ash into architecture and will make the rumor of a palace into weighty shape. Outside the offices, in the hush that follows orders and petitioning, the city inhales. Some breathe with relief, others with dread. The hand that posts a list and the hand that draws a rope are now the hands that will remake Rome. How they will remake it, whether as streets for many or frontages for a few, remains the city's central, unquiet question. A soldier taps his spear twice at the edge of the Forum, a small signal to begin enforcement at first light. First light finds the city in 2 tempos, one official and clipped, the other ragged and human. The soldiers move quietly, more like a careful tide than a hammer. Their sandals whisper across ash. Their boots crunch where embers still glow, faint beneath rubble. At the edges of lots marked imperial use, they set up cordons, ropes and poles, chalked boundary lines, and small, tidy piles of stones that mean, do not cross. Where a family had stacked their few salvaged goods the night before, a soldier now plants a stake and draws a shallow circle in the ash. That circle reads like a verdict to anyone who knows its grammar. Evictions begin not as dramatic expulsions, but as a series of small, inexorable pressures. A clerk recites the magistrate's order, in a voice practiced for formality. It sounds like a litany. Immediate clearance required, possessions to be removed within 24 hours. Owners may petition for delay. For some, the delay is enough. For others, it is a thin mercy that does little to stave off loss. Men carry away chests and pots with cheeks hollowed by exhaustion. Women fold blankets and cradle soot-streaked children who have learned to sleep anywhere. The street smells of wet lime where crews have been sprinkling water to settle dust, of tobacco smoke in the hands of men trying to make small comforts, and of the faint, stubborn perfume of char that will not wipe away. Resistance is improvisatory and intimate. A collegium gathers at the edge of a proposed clearance and lays down a row of witnesses, neighbors who will swear that families have lived there for decades. A guildmaster, his face set in the harsh light of responsibility, offers to bring tools and men to reface a frontage in brick if only the lot will stay in community hands. Petitions are bartered like goods, signatures for a promise, witnesses for grain. Sometimes the freedmen answer with a curt nod. Sometimes they buy off resistance with promises of contracts. The transactions are not always clean, but they are the language through which a city negotiates its fate. Where the rope is strict, the city shows its more desperate ingenuity. A baker whose oven lay just inside an allocated parcel rigs a small temporary kiln from salvaged tiles and puts it under a canopy. He charges less than before and works by candlelight. Marcellus the potter, whose kiln had been listed for reassessment, hides a small, precious shard, a bowl rim, and vows to make one piece that will prove his craft and his claim. He pushes clay at midnight, with hands that have learned to read the subtle grief in a lump of earth. The sound of his wheel in a borrowed shelter is the small song of survival. At the same time, enforcement reveals new violences. Soldiers remove goods with a procedural calm that carries a human cruelty. A woman's box of family tokens is halved, some items taken as evidence of occupancy, and some left in a heap. Where one man pleads for time to salvage a chest, a soldier shrugs and cites the clerk's order. Such moments become stories people carry to the magistrate, to friends, and to taverns. They turn private grief into public complaint. Tacitus and others note the brutality of requisitions and the way force enforces law in the aftermath. Here, in the streets, you feel that force close and sharp. Religious gestures continue beside every official act. Priests bless cords laid for measurement. Women carry lares to the edge of cleared lots and set them upon improvised altars beneath awnings, murmuring vows to any god who will listen. A child offers a half-burned fig to an altar stump, and a neighbor, older, with soot in the hollows of his cheeks, places a coin beside it. These are not empty rites. They are claim-making in another register. I was here, I belong, let the gods mark me. Such acts have force because social memory is not only ink and rope, but practice and witness. The city's markets bend to the new rhythms. Where kilns are communal, potters organize shifts. Tile makers deliver loads earlier in the morning to avoid the long lines at the magistrate's permit office. Merchants who profited from pre-fire rents now scramble for contracts with overseers of the imperial works. The market's smell is a layered one: clay and soot and wet lime, the smoky note of repair mingling with the faint tang of small triumphs. Bread baked and sold, a bowl purchased and held like a trophy. Political calculation becomes more visible. Freedmen wield their ropes not only with technical efficiency, but with a practiced eye toward profit. They assign lots, yes, but they also suggest contractors and masons who will be given priority for supplies. A mason who speaks the right name at the right moment secures a line of work that will feed his household for months. A guildmaster who offers loyalty to the imperial steward wins measured favor. Tacitus records such networks of patronage and profit. In the ash-smeared present, those networks look less like abstract corruption and more like the city's functioning economy, one in which access to patronage and material determines survival. In the middle of triumph and dispossession, curious small finds keep surfacing, as if to remind the city of its human volume. A child pulls from a collapsed beam a small intact gaming piece, ivory, smoothed by use. An old woman discovers beneath a floorboard a packet of letters, fragile and smudged, that name neighbors and debts in a hand she recognizes. These artifacts become leverage in petitions. They are also private reliquaries of lives that official lists would otherwise erase. As foundations are staked and letters signed, the labor itself starts to speak in a new language. Crews begin to deliver marble and dressed stone to the Palatine slopes with a quiet, relentless industry. Wagons creak under the weight of heavy timbers and packed tiles. The air near the palace smells different now, resin and exotic wood, the sharp metallic scent of tools struck against stone, the faint sweetness of oil used for polishing. It is a smell that promises grandeur, and it promises a different city than before. At dusk, a small knot of citizens gathers near a newly placed office to await the magistrate's bulletin. They bring petitions, signatures, and a frantic hope that appeals will be heard. The woman with the half-charred wax tablet arrives with witnesses, her eyes tired but resolute. Marcellus, clutching his small finished bowl, walks beside a group of guildsmen. The stewards and clerks file out to meet the crowd with parchment in hand. But before the bulletin is read, a rider arrives from the Palatine, bearing a sealed order stamped with an imperial sigil. The rider dismounts and hands the envelope to the steward. He breaks the seal, scans the page, and the color drains from his face. A private movement. A folded gesture that means something in the world of paperwork and property that will matter more than any speech. He slips the note into his robe without speaking. The crowd waits. The steward steps forward to read the bulletin aloud, and his voice, practiced and steady, falters for half a heartbeat before he regains it. His first words tell of temporary protections and prioritized materials. Then, with a tone that rearranges the morning's logic, he announces an unexpected addendum. Certain parcels adjacent to the Palatine have been immediately requisitioned for imperial construction of lasting public benefit. The words fall like measured stones. For those who had hoped petitions and guild witness would alter outcomes, the addendum reads like a closed door. For those who profit, masons, freedmen in the right whispering circles, it signals work and coin. The sound in the crowd is not merely disappointment. It is the recognition that the ash has not only made the city vulnerable, but that vulnerability will be made into architecture. As night gathers, a few men linger in the shadow of a column, speaking in low voices. One of them, a clerk who had warmed the wax earlier that day, reveals that the sealed order carries a clause he did not expect: immediate priority for materials from a Mediterranean source known to be both costly and prestigious. The name is enough to set teeth on edge: marble from a distant quarry, rare timbers for inlaid panels. Where such materials are mandated, contracts will follow, and contracts will determine who builds and who is built over. A child's foot scuffs at the ash. A dog snuffles at the edge of a discarded tile. The city sleeps fitfully, its edges already shifting. Outside the forum, under a palimpsest of soot and planning, men with ropes begin to measure again for dawn's work. Morning moves into the first weeks of rebuilding, with a stubborn, grinding industry. Work begins at dawn, not with fanfare, but with the precise ritual of labor: masons testing chisels, kiln owners coaxing flames, carpenters measuring posts twice and then once more. The Palatine slopes are a hive of activity. Wagons creak under dressed stone, men carry numbered beams. The air there smells of fresh sap and lime, a different perfume than the city's recent smoke. It promises order. For ordinary inhabitants, the mornings are acts of salvage and protest. Women sweep thresholds again and again to keep ash from smelling like surrender. Children play at the edges of cordoned lots, turning pieces of tile into toys. Guilds organize crews, masons pool labor, potters share kiln time, carpenters coordinate timber runs. This coordination is practical and political. An organized guild appears stronger in petitions. At the center of the day is the choreography between rope and seal. Freedmen with measuring cords pace the cleared streets. Clerks copy lot numbers. Magisterial seals are stamped. A rope drawn across a lane is a grammar of power. When a freedman pronounces it, men obey because the rope is backed by soldiers and purses. Where foundations are staked, families dismantle in a softer, slower violence. An old woman sits by a neat circle of goods: cooking pots, a bundle of cloth, a scratched spindle, given 24 hours to clear. Soldiers measure. Their hands are efficient and quiet. She lifts a small wax tablet and traces a faded lease with trembling fingers. The tablet is proof, and proof is fragile. A more public conflict crystallizes that day. A guild of masons confronts a freedman over a contested lane. They bring witnesses and a half-charred lease. The freedman demands precise proof of continuous tenancy. One witness, a stooped potter, swears his oath in the magistrate's formula. Another, a woman with soot in her hair, confirms years of trade. The freedman studies the tablets, then, with a practiced indifference, offers a compromise. Retain the shop if the guild agrees to reface the frontage in brick and accept new frontage rights that will make the facade effectively public. It is a mixed victory. The mason's smile is tight. The shop remains, but the frontage will be public property in all but name. The guild disperses to work with tools that now carry both hope and the knowledge that the city's architecture will change their lives. Alongside negotiation moves performance. Public punishments, those grim spectacles Tacitus records, continue to provide a brutal sense of order. The crowd watches, some with relief, others with a sour taste of injustice. The state converts fear into ritual. The spectacle narrows the moral confusion of loss into a visible enemy. As imperial demands crystallize, the material market shifts. Orders for prized timbers and marble arrive. Merchants who handle such goods appear with ledgers and higher prices. A potter watches the cost of lead for glazes climb and knows he must adapt his wares. Laborers find steadier pay on imperial projects, yet that work means losing the small autonomy of a neighborhood shop. Cultural life adapts. Poets write elegies for streets and scorn the appetite of power. Tavern talk invents images. An artificial lake here, endless marble there, that feed rumor and fear. Such stories travel differently from posted decrees. They infect memory and will later shape how people tell the fire's tale. Then, while clearing a ruined workshop, Marcellus the potter makes a discovery that will prick the city's conscience. Tucked in a box, beneath a slab, he finds letters, simple notes between a former shopkeeper and a steward's assistant. The letters mention payments, favors, and a phrase that repeats, "the plan." They hint that some conversations about land and building took place before notices were posted. The find is dangerous. If publicized, the letters would suggest foreknowledge and private bargaining. If concealed, they offer leverage. Marcellus takes the bundle to the guildmaster, who examines the faded script by lantern light. The guildmaster's face is a map of calculation. Publicity could force a pause or inflame crowds. Secrecy could secure a bargain. That night, the letters are wrapped into a pot and carried to the guild hall. Men argue softly, use them in a petition, or hold them until contracts are tendered. Each choice tastes of risk. The letters could derail plans or make the guild's terms stronger. In the lanes, women stitch burnt hems and sew small pouches for hidden papers. Priests murmur brief rites for households whose shrines survived. Children run with makeshift marbles, ignorant of the leases that will make them adults elsewhere. The guildmaster fears not only loss of workshop, but the erosion of neighborhood memory. Once a street is refaced and renamed, the stories of who lived there fade, and with them the subtle honors that bound people to place. Tomorrow, someone will decide whether those letters are a spark or a shield. The choice will be made by men who count material first and lives second. The pot in the guild hall sits heavy with possibility. Dawn leans in the windows like a careful witness. The guild hall, a low room stuffed with benches and clay dust, smells of wet earth and warmed oil. Men sit in a semicircle around a wrapped pot where the letters hide. Potters with the smudged forearms of their craft, a mason whose nails still show lime, a carved-faced guildmaster whose voice has the patient edge of someone used to bargaining. Outside, the city begins its daily litany. Carts creak, a distant hammer sings on stone, children chase each other through alleys flecked with ash. Inside, the conversation is a different cadence, slow, legal, intimate. The letters are not just paper, they are a possibility that could be spoken aloud and change the map of the city. The guild's debate follows a modest liturgy. First, the facts. The letters exist, they name stewards and speak of the plan, and the ink carries the old bureaucratic hand that makes clerks pause. Second, the stakes. Publicity could shame the powerful, but it could also provoke violent reprisals, confiscations, and charges of sedition. Third, the tactics. Go public with the guild's petition at the magistrates' hearing tomorrow, or use the letters privately as leverage to secure contractual guarantees for local craftsmen. Marcellus the potter holds the finished bowl he made late into the night, clay still whispering in his palm. He leans forward and speaks in a voice that is not loud but precise. Show the letters to the magistrate at the hearing. Let the law do the work. Let witnesses swear. Some guildmen nod, others frown. One older potter, his thumb scarred by a kiln's memory, shakes his head. If the magistrate's pen is weak, he says, our evidence will be turned into an apology to the freedman who measures the rope. The room hums with the truth of that line. Law is only as strong as the hands that enforce it. They decide on a hybrid. A petition will be drafted, public and formal, that cites the letters as evidence of private dealing and requests a temporary injunction on any immediate clearances contiguous to the Palatine until an inquiry is held. The guild will present witnesses, shopkeepers, neighbors, a clerk who remembers a meeting. They will lodge copies of the letters with a magistrate and also distribute a summary among other collegia to rally larger support. It is the kind of plan that tastes of risk and of hope in equal measure. Preparation becomes ritual. Marcellus smooths the bowl one last time, sets it in a basket with a shard he promises to show as proof of craft, and walks with the guildmaster to the magistrate's court. The basket smells of damp clay and linseed. The street smells of wet lime and bread. As they move, they gather signatures. A baker who had kept accounts for the block, a lamp maker who recalls counting tiles, a laundress whose family had long kept a ledger. Each signature is an act of witness and courage. At the magistrate's office, the clerks accept the petition with the ceremonial coolness of men who process grief in wax. The main clerk, a woman with ink-stained fingers and a small heat line of soot across her cuff, offers a curt nod and whispers that hearings are scheduled and that evidence should be placed on the next docket. The guildmaster's hand trembles a little as he places the wrapped pot on the table. The clerk takes it with the practiced care reserved for fragile things, contracts, tablets, shrines, and tucks the bundle into the registry. News of the petition moves faster than the scribal hand can record it. In the market, stallholders lean on their stalls and trade versions. The guild has letters, they say. The letters accuse stewards of planning before the public notices. At a fountain, a woman spits ash and says the whole thing smells of palace appetite. At a small shrine, a child leaves a smoothed pebble, as if laying down a piece of the city's future. Rumor is a living economy. It buys momentum with breath. Meanwhile, in the palatial orders, news travels too, more quietly, but it travels. Freedmen learn that a guild has lodged a petition. An imperial steward, who had measured ropes and kept lists, hears of the petition with a small, sharp attention. Paper in official hands is both threat and instrument. He sits at a low table, the smell of polished wood and oil about him, and reads a summary brought by a courier. His face is a study in measured calm. He drafts a short note, seals it, and sends it with a rider toward the magistrate's office. The seal is small but significant, a reminder that imperial interest still walks in the same streets as guilds and kiln smoke. The hearing convenes in the basilica the next morning. A public bench holds men in togas, but the hearing's real audience is the city. Guildsmen, neighbors, freedmen, soldiers, mothers with soot on their cheeks. The magistrate's voice reads the guild's petition aloud, slow and precise. Witnesses are called. The baker testifies to trade and tenancy. The lamp maker confirms meetings he overheard. The clerk produces the letters, each one unwrapped with ritual care so the ink's grooves catch in public light. The air is tight with expectation. When the steward's name is read aloud, one of the names that appears in the letters, a flush moves through the crowd. The steward, present by arrangement, does not show surprise. He stands because officials are expected to answer charges in public. His cheeks are ash-smudged, his hands steady. He listens to the reading. Then, in a voice that is soft but formal, he offers explanation. That pre-planning notes were preliminary dialogues about urban safety and supply, and that any appearance of advantage was unintended. He produces documents, lists of suppliers, receipts for timber purchases, and gestures to the clerk's copy of imperial instructions that call for rapid sourcing of certain materials. His defense is legalistic and plausible. The guild listens. Some men whisper that the steward's paper could be prepared in advance. Others think the steward's proof will be enough for a magistrate wary of imperial displeasure. The magistrate, whose duty sits like a heavy thing on his shoulders, admits the complexity aloud. A public interest in rebuilding, imperial claims, and private contracts can coexist, he says, and the law must weigh them. He orders a pause. An inquiry will be opened, witnesses will be cross-examined, and the magistrate will request that any immediate clearances adjacent to the Palatine be suspended until the inquiry concludes. For a beat, the crowd exhales. The guild feels its first public success, but the respite is small and flavored with caution. Magistrates can be slow, inquiries can be delayed, and imperial seals can outrun civic patience. Outside the basilica, a freedman steps into the shade and smiles with a tight, private glance. He signals a runner. The runner moves fast to the Palatine. That night, as the city begins to fold towards sleep, Marcellus walks home with the bowl he made, his palm on its rim like a small benediction. The air tastes of lime and rain. He does not know that the runner the freedman sent will arrive at the palace before dawn, with a short, sealed note that balances urgency and patronage. He does not know that some men prefer settlement to scrutiny. Behind his quiet step, the city is divided into small camps of hope and fear. The guild has won a legal breathing space. Someone else has already moved to close it. A messenger arrives at the Palatine before dawn with a sealed note that promises choices most men do not get to weigh. compromise, contract, or confrontation. The rider reaches the Palatine before first light, the sealed note a small weight against his ribs. The palace at dawn smells of oil and warmed bronze. Servants move with slow precision, lighting braziers and unrolling plans on low tables. The steward who had once paced the ruined streets receives the courier with a curt nod and breaks the seal with fingers already stained by ink and ash. He reads quickly, his eyes narrowing and the muscles at his jaw tightening like ropes being pulled taut. Where the guild had hoped for law's slow machinery, the palace responds with speed. The note asks for an audience and offers a terse set of options. Immediate contractual guarantees for specified craftsmen in exchange for expedited clearance. A small list of parcels temporarily reserved for imperial projects with compensation negotiated by imperial agents. Or, failing agreement, an order that will be enforced without further delay. The steward's face does not betray surprise. He stands, calls a freedman, and unfolds the day into a dozen small acts. Riders sent to guild halls, a list of favored contractors called to the Palatine, a dispatched messenger to the magistrate with a handwritten note that courts compromise. The palace's language is calm and economical. Its instruments are ropes, ledgers, and promises of work. For those who can hold such promises, masons who know the right stonemasons, potters who can offer wheel time to the palace's household, the offer is a lifeline. For those who lack the right contacts, it is a thin consolation. News travels fast along the street's back channels. By mid-morning, guild delegates file into a small antechamber off the Palatine court. The room smells faintly of incense, the air heavy with the perfume reserved for ceremonial meetings. A freedman, broad-shouldered, polite, and efficient, receives them with the institutional calm of one who knows the shape of favors. He lays out the palace's terms. The guild's petition will be considered if the guild agrees to nominate a list of craftsmen who will be guaranteed contracts for the imperial build. In return, the palace will suspend immediate clearances on specified lots for a limited period and provide priority access to imperial supplies of tiles and lime. It is a pragmatic bargain and a moral test. The guildmasters exchange glances that measure the cost in pride as much as in brick. The offer transforms the abstract language of public interest into a ledger, pieces of work, lists of names, weeks of supply. For some, the promise of sustained employment outweighs the indignity of negotiation. For others, the palace's terms smell like a barter of community for coin. Marcellus the potter, who had carried his small bowl to the hearing like a talisman, feels the possibility as a pressure on his tender hope. To be chosen is to survive. To be overlooked is to be pushed outward. The freedman's office is a study in ritualized economy. He produces a scroll with clauses that read like business and law at once, names of craftsmen to be guaranteed, a schedule of payments, a clause promising material allocation from specific suppliers. He speaks of mutual advantage and public good with a voice that is almost literal, because in that room, advancement is simply arithmetic. Marble and rare timber will be purchased through imperial channels. Brick and tile will be parceled to those on the list. The freedman's smile is small and efficient. It includes the unspoken notion that the palace's favors always carry strings. Outside the Palatine, rumor curves around corners like smoke. The offer, if accepted, will be read in alleys and hearths as both rescue and capitulation. For those who value independence and neighborhood rights over the steady pay of palace contracts, the offer seems like an erosion of communal autonomy. For those with mouths to feed and debts to settle, the proposal reads like deliverance. The city's moral arithmetic is not universal, it is personal. That afternoon, the guild holds a consultation in the guild hall. Men gather, potters, masons, carpenters, faces lit by a single lamp and the small, steady candor of hardship. They debate not only the palace's practical terms, but the gossip that surrounds them. Which craftsman does the palace prefer? Who already has relationships with imperial suppliers? Which names will be elevated and which consigned to the periphery? The letters Marcellus found lie on the table like a hidden pressure. They complicate the moral choice. If the palace's plans were whispered before the public notices, then agreeing quietly may only reward prior advantage. If they go public, the inquiry might expose impropriety, but could also provoke immediate enforcement. The debate becomes intimate and fierce. One man, grizzled, the scar of a kiln still visible on his cheek, argues to accept the palace's offer, "Work feeds sons," he says, voice rough as a whetstone. Another, young, stubborn, answers that survival without dignity is still loss. "We rebuild ourselves, or someone will rebuild us for profit." They measure the argument not only in principle, but in pounds of tile and weeks of wages. Practicalities intervene. A wife sick with fever needs medicine. A debt for grain grows daily. The kiln's coaling will not wait. Each vote is a ledger entry with human remedy written beside it. As the guild votes, a courier from the magistrate arrives with his own sealed reply. The magistrate offers an alternative, a formal inquiry that will be expedited if the guild will allow a limited court-supervised pause and clearances for certain blocks. In return, the magistrate requests access to the letters as evidence. The magistrate's proposal is a legal middle path, less immediate than palace contracts, but more oriented toward public adjudication. It promises the dignity of a hearing, the possibility of public accountability, and a slower, more uncertain remedy. The palace's offer, by contrast, promises immediate bread. The guild's choice splits them down the middle. Some members favor the palace's immediate contracts for the sake of their families. Others demand the magistrate's inquiry as a matter of principle and communal integrity. The decision will determine not only who works on the palace, but whether the city's recovery proceeds by private bargain or public law. At dusk, the guild's vote is tallied. It is a narrow majority for negotiation with the palace, with conditions that the list of guaranteed craftsmen include representatives from each major collegium, that promised materials be verified by public scrutineers, that any contracts be accompanied by a short-term suspension of eviction for affected lots. The freedman signs in ink. The guildmaster stamps the tablet with his ring. The accord reads like a fragile treaty, knit from mutual need and mutual mistrust. The celebration that follows is small. A communal cup of wine, a bowl of stew, hands clasped in the awkward relief of those who have traded voice for work. Marcellus drinks slowly, feeling the contract's warmth and a shadow that clings just behind it. The guild's papers are sealed, and a courier rides to the magistrate with copies. A second courier returns with a curt nod from the palace. On the street, men who had watched petition hearings with suspicion now whisper that some measure of justice has been won. Yet not everyone breathes easy. A handful of craftsmen who were not named on the list gather in the dark by the riverbank, their faces thrown into relief by torchlight. One of them, young, with hands still lacquered from clay, pounds his fist into his palm and says a phrase that tastes like a threat. "If we are ignored now, we will be forgotten later." Their threat is not only of speech, it is the implicit promise that excluded men will find other ways to survive and to resist. The palace's rewards begin to flow the next morning. Official letters, corded ropes for measured lots that will now be used by palace subcontractors, and the arrival of special wagon loads of lime and tile. Men who carry imperial tokens feel a small dignity in their work. Men who were left off the lists feel a new insult. The city concentrates labor and divides the poor into those who can count on steady coin and those who must invent new economies on the edge. As the sun drops, a small torchlight procession forms outside the guild hall. Excluded craftsmen walking with their tools, their faces hard, their voices low and building. They move toward the Palatine not with the empty menace of rumor, but with the practical intent of men who need work, and who have been refused it. In their pockets are not petitions, but a collection of small implements and a plan that is not yet spoken aloud. The night swells with a new tension. A negotiated peace has been struck between palace and guild, but those left out will not accept a map drawn without them. The city has chosen compromise over inquiry, or perhaps both, and now the fog of compromise will meet the hard edges of exclusion. A torchbearer at the head of the excluded procession pauses and looks up at the Palatine. He lifts his chin like a man measuring a rope in his head and steps forward. A quiet murmur ripples through the sleeping alleys. Something is moving toward the palace. They come at dusk like a slow, determined tide, tools slung over shoulders, faces sharpened by hunger and the sting of being passed over. The excluded procession moves up the Palatine slope under torchlight, not as a mob, but as a compact body with the quiet purpose of people who have been offered no other option. Iron and clay clink softly. The smell of wet lime and fresh-cut timber from the palace projects drifts down to meet the smoke scent of their old streets. For the men and women walking, every step is an argument. We can build, we can craft, we can feed our children if given bread and work. The torchlight throws hard lines on hands that know the language of making. At the palace gate, the pavement is swept clean, and the smell of oil shines off bronze. Guards pause, uncertain at first. These are not brigands, but craftsmen with a ledger of complaints and the small dignity of tools. A freedman who has been moving through the city's contracts steps forward, his expression careful as a mason's eye. He hears the men's case: names, debts, apprentices, a kind of catalog of ordinary lives. He listens until the flames of the torches make his face a study in ash and shadow. What happens next is not a shouted reprise of riot, but an old Roman solution: negotiation, weary and practical. The steward, mindful of the magistrate's expedited inquiry and the palace's own need for labor, proposes a test: a short list of supplementary craftsmen, those the guild had originally overlooked, will be admitted to palace contracts on provisional terms. In return, the guild will extend a limited share of work and a promise of shared kiln time to neighboring artisans. The freedman offers immediate wages for a short-term task: to finish a prioritized section of a foundation that must go up before winter rains. It is a compromise worked out in steps measured like a mason's rule: tasks, materials, names, terms. For many, the bargain is both rescue and humiliation. Men accept because sons are hungry and kilns demand coal. Others walk away, furious, their pride unmended. The compromise does not pretend to heal what the fire took: the old networks of trust, the precise lines of neighborhood life, but it stitches a practical seam: work now, and a chance at defending rights later in court. The decision is small, mortal, and true. In the months that follow, the city rearranges itself along new textures. Where timber once overhung narrow lanes, taller brick fronts rise, their faces stamped with mortar that smells of lime and the clean bite of newness. Tile work glitters where thatch had once flamed. New rules, drafted in magistrates' rooms and enforced by ropes and soldiers, favor fire-resistant materials and straighter streets. Those reforms are not solely imperial generosity, they are the product of hard learning. The flame taught Rome a lesson in practical geometry, and the city's bones change accordingly. But change is never neutral. The Domus Aurea, Nero's great palace complex that later chroniclers will curse or admire, takes shape with marble and rare timber. It becomes both a spectacle and a wound in public memory, a place where the city's ash is turned into imperial scale. Contemporary writers, Tacitus among them, will treat the palace as evidence of appetite and misrule. Later centuries will debate whether the emperor's projects were artistic ambition, desperate grandiosity, or the exercise of monarchical entitlement in a city still strewn with salvaged bowls and half-burned wax tablets. Alongside the architecture, darker threads remain. The scapegoating that followed the fire, brutal punishments visited on Christians, does not vanish in a single season. The public spectacles Tacitus describes leave marks on private lives. Families who watched neighbors seized and burned carry that trauma like a scar, a long, hard ache that will pass into rumor and into history. The persecution answers rage with brutality and provides a grim rehearsal in how power finds a focus in minorities when communities search for blame. Yet for most Romans, the story of the fire is stitched through with smaller human continuities. Marcellus the potter, who once clasped a finished bowl as if it were a benediction, becomes a subcontractor under the new order. His kiln is rebuilt in a communal yard, brick-faced and hotter, but also inspected. He works with men he had once quarried with, and they bicker as men do about glaze recipes and the width of rims. At night he counts coins that will buy bread, and sometimes a bit of silver to keep his son in school. The wage is not glory, but it is life. Objects recovered from the ash, charred tablets, a stylus, a small girl's bead, become the city's private monuments. In kitchens and shrines, they anchor testimony. Here someone lived, here someone loved, here someone owed. These artifacts will later be the archaeologists' small witnesses. For contemporaries, they were the kept memories, small reliquaries that preserve the soft facts of ordinary lives. When new walls are raised, such objects are wrapped into niches or slipped beneath floorboards, private acts of continuity amid public reordering. Politically, the fire is a hinge. It sharpens the hand of the emperor and the agency of freedmen, but it also hardens the tools of law. Building regulations are codified more precisely. Magistrates learn to read the balance between public safety and private rights. In centuries to come, historians will trace large trends: architectural reform, imperial patronage, social displacement, to these weeks and months after July AD 64. That is the macro story, a city reshaped by flame, government, and barter. But the human story is quieter and more complicated. Families find new courtyards and claim them like small victories. Guilds that bargained for palace work keep some of their autonomy by insisting on public scrutineers and shared kiln time. Others fall away, the names of small craftsmen dissolving into the crowd of the dispossessed. The smell of smoke lingers on the tongues of old men who will not forget the night when Rome's sky burned. The children born in the rebuilding know the city by its brick and by the tales their parents tell at supper. In the long view, Rome's burning night becomes a chapter in the city's stubborn narrative, disaster followed by repair, appetite tempered by law, and an empire that chooses both grandeur and the uneasy calculus of pragmatic relief. The city learns an architecture of caution even as it produces monuments to power. That duality, practical rebuilding and imperial display, becomes a defining pattern. Years later, when the Domus Aurea's grottos are filled and later stripped by successors, and when poets and pamphleteers argue in taverns about appetite and virtue, someone will kneel in a newly paved lane and brush away a thin layer of ash, almost as if clearing a name from a slate. A child will find, in a seam of mortar, a tiny bead from a past that the palace could not swallow. She will keep it, perhaps, and tuck it into a pocket as she grows. The bead will become a private proof that ordinary lives endure when empires attempt to rewrite streets. The smell of smoke, then, does not disappear so much as it changes form, from a horrible immediacy to a memory-inflected scent that sits under mortar and song. And that is Rome's ultimate lesson in the burning night. Cities are fragile and stubborn at once. They burn, they rebuild, and they carry, in their smallest objects, the testimonies that future ages read. A child polishing a bead in a newly paved alley will, someday, whisper its name to a friend and, for a few seconds, teach history how to hold both ruin and hope. Morning turns into a long evening where the city finally learns the measure of its new shape. The Domus Aurea rises in the minds of many, like a promise or a wound, depending on which street you remember. Marble and rare timber arrive on wagons. Men haul stone up the Palatine with backs steady as laws. The palace glitters in ways the old alleys did not. Polished surfaces, frescoed rooms, water tricks in gardens that feel like foreign music. For the privileged, the work signals patronage and wages. For those pushed aside by measurement and seal, the palace is a visible wound. Marcellus, at his rebuilt kiln, is small proof of a larger stubbornness. He tends the heat, watches glaze bloom into color, and counts for the first time in months the slow, rewarding trickle of coins. He teaches his apprentice to read clay the way an old man reads weather, by temperature, by smell, by the way lime crisps on the lip of a bowl. On quiet nights, he keeps a charred shard in his pocket, one of the pieces he rescued during the fire, and when the house grows cold, he holds it and remembers the night that reshaped everything and everyone he knew. Public memory hardens into law and habit. Building regulations drafted amid grief become formal codes. Magistrates refine how leases are recorded and witnesses sworn. Fire breaks and brick facings change the city's sound and light. Collegia that bargained for work keep communal rights. Others vanish when names fail to be copied into registers. The law is both shelter and sieve. Those who suffered the earliest persecutions, Christians and other marginalized groups, carry their stories into private memory and public narrative. Tacitus records the cruelty. Later, Christian writers will remember martyrdoms as both horror and seed. The city's attempt to find causes sometimes sought the wrong answers. Scapegoating eased panic, but left wounds that would not be soothed by bricks. Artisans who worked on imperial projects tell different versions. Some speak of honest contracts and steady pay that fed families. Others speak of compromise and shame, bargains that traded civic space for wages, dignity for survival. Both are true. Men who signed imperial contracts later argued in taverns and at hearths about what they had given up, and what they had bought for their children. Long after the immediate frictions, cultural life remakes meaning. Poets write elegies that name particular streets. Tavern stories compress the complicated bargains into cautionary tales. Families insert rescued objects into household altars. A lares wrapped in soot becomes the center of a new ritual. These acts of memory are practical and tender. They ensure a family's claim to place in ways a magistrate's seal cannot. Small ceremonies hold civic history like a fragile pot. Archaeology, centuries hence, will read these layers of wood and mortar as stratified truth. Excavators find brick laid over timber and read in mortar the story the city's laws rewrote. The Domus Aurea will later be stripped by successors and reshaped. Palaces do not stay the same, and their ambition becomes fuel for later projects. The physical record provides fragments, but no single voice can claim the neighborhood's lived truth. In the end, Rome's burning night makes a different kind of city, more cautious in its bones, more contested in its maps, more human in its fractures. The immediate tragedy, the smell of pitch, the arithmetic of loss, becomes a texture sewn through memory. People relearn where to store grain, how to bind a lease with witnesses, and which neighbors can be trusted when ropes are pulled. They also learn that power answers with projects that can both feed and dispossess. There is a small, ordinary grace threaded through the larger calculus. Marcellus's apprentice grows into his stead. He marries a woman from a neighboring block and keeps a bowl on the family table that his father once sold to an imperial steward. A guild secures a communal kiln that serves apprentices for a generation. A woman who came to the forum with a half-charred tablet becomes a witness defending other families. These continuities are not triumphs over loss. They are the slow, patient work of repair. The final moral is this: cities are not merely collections of walls and rules. They are archives of small acts: the drying of a child's rag, the sealing of a lease by a neighbor's thumbprint, the sharing of a loaf in a courtyard. The Domus Aurea may stand as a ruler's answer to ruin, but it does not consume the lives written in soot and shard. Those lives persist in kitchens, in guild halls, and in the small objects folded into pockets. Even so, ash keeps secrets. Layers of burned timbers and sealed tablets wait beneath later pavements, and sometimes a single shard reappears in a builder's hand and asks a new question. When that happens, the city listens differently, not to the loud pronouncements of power, but to the small voice of the household. Somewhere, in the mortar of a later street, a child's bead will be found by someone who does not know the name it once held. The bead will speak in silence, and a historian will try to read it. The story closes both closed and open. Closed because immediate fires are stamped into law and brick. Open because memory, private, stubborn, domestic, keeps the past alive in the smallest of things. The smell of smoke does not vanish. It transmutes from an acute hot thing into a settled scent in the city's bones, and into the private rituals of those who will not let the night be forgotten. A charred shard is wrapped again and placed beneath a family altar. Decades later, a child will find it and, without knowing why, will press it to her lips. For a second, the bead seems to answer back, less a message than a question, and the city listens again, patient and unfinished.